Jack Lawson lived a life built on quiet kindness and hard work. In Greenville, a town tucked deep into winter's snowdrifts, Jack was the man people called when something broke: cars that wouldn't start, furnaces wheezing out in the cold, snowblowers buried under fresh powder. At 47, he wasn't a man of wealth, but he'd earned every bit of his modest life: a small, weathered garage, an old tow truck that still roared to life, and a reputation as someone who could be counted on. The walls of Lawson's garage told his story. They carried the smell of oil and steel, the sharp clink of tools, and years of quiet labor. His hands, calloused and streaked with grease, had spent decades fixing the things people needed most. To Jack, there was pride in that, knowing he could mend what was broken, even if most folks never thought to thank him. But Jack didn't do it for praise. Some people left marks in life with ambition or wealth. Jack left his by helping, one repair at a time. But tonight was supposed to be different. It was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in years, Jack had promised himself he'd close up early. Maria, his younger sister, had insisted, "You're coming to dinner, Jack." No excuses, she'd said in that stern, motherly way she'd perfected. "The kids miss you. You need this as much as they do." Jack had nearly argued, but Maria was right. He did need it. He could already picture her table, the ham steaming fresh from the oven, buttery rolls piled high, the kids' laughter filling the air as they tore into presents. It was a rare thing for Jack to be part of something bigger than himself, and though he didn't say it aloud, he was looking forward to it more than he cared to admit. Outside the garage, snow had begun falling again, soft and steady, the flakes swirling like tiny pieces of glass beneath the glow of the street lamp. Jack stood near the workbench, wiping his hands on an old rag as the clock on the wall ticked towards 6:45 p.m. The garage was finally quiet. The last job of the day finished: a stubborn tire, now fitted and ready to roll. He glanced at the clock one last time. "If I leave now, I'll make it before dinner's on the table," he thought. Pulling on his thick winter coat, Jack grabbed his keys and headed for the light switch. But just as his hand touched it, the phone on the wall rang sharp, insistent, cutting through the silence. Jack froze. The phone almost never rang this late. For a fleeting moment, he thought about ignoring it. Whoever it was could wait. He deserved tonight. He deserved the dinner table, the kids, and the sound of a home he hadn't known in years. The ringing didn't stop. Jack let out a sigh, his shoulders slumping. With a heavy step, he turned back and picked up the receiver. Lawson's garage. Jack speaking. There was a pause, just a beat of hesitation, and then a woman's voice came through, soft but tinged with panic. "Oh, thank goodness. Is this the mechanic shop?" Jack's tired voice softened instinctively. "Yes, Ma, I am. What's going on?" "I'm so sorry to call so late," she said quickly, her words stumbling over each other. "But my car broke down. I'm just outside of town on Highway 19, near mile marker 12. I've been trying to get it started for over an hour, but it's no use, and it's..." Her voice caught, almost like she didn't want to say it out loud. "It's getting colder." Jack ran a hand over his face, glancing out the window. The snow had thickened, the wind picking up to rattle the old garage doors. He let out a slow breath. Mile marker 12. That stretch of road was lonely on a good day, let alone in a snowstorm. He thought of Maria's house, the warmth waiting for him, the kids sneaking peeks at their presents, but the image vanished just as quickly. Someone was out there, stranded and cold. Jack's conscience, that old stubborn thing, wouldn't let him leave her there. "All right," he said firmly, already pulling his coat tighter. "You stay put, you hear me? Keep the engine off to save fuel and bundle up. I'll be there as soon as I can." "Oh, thank you," the woman exhaled, relief flooding her voice. "I didn't think anyone would come." "Don't worry about that now," Jack replied gently. "Just sit tight." He hung up the phone, grabbed his toolbox, and stomped into his boots. Outside, the snow swallowed the quiet town whole, and Jack's breath billowed out like steam as he trudged toward the old tow truck. It sat parked beside the garage, rusted in places but as reliable as he was. The truck started with a sputtering roar, and Jack climbed in, flipping on the headlights. The snow danced in the beams like restless ghosts as he pulled onto the road. The drive out of town was slow. The storm had grown heavier, thick flakes battering the windshield while the wipers fought to keep up. Jack gripped the wheel, steady and focused, his old truck groaning through the snowdrifts. In the silence of the cab, his mind wandered back to Maria's kitchen. They're probably sitting down to dinner by now, he thought. Maria's pulling the ham from the oven. Emily's sneaking rolls when she thinks no one's looking. Tyler's already talking too loud just to make them laugh. The thought tightened his chest, and for a moment he let himself feel the weight of what he was leaving behind tonight. Maria would understand, she always did, but the disappointment still stung. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the glow of taillights appeared in the distance, buried halfway beneath a mound of snow. Jack eased the truck to a stop behind the stranded car, leaving the engine running for warmth. The cold hit him like a slap when he stepped outside, biting through his coat and stinging his cheeks. Snow crunched under his boots as he grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the car. Inside, he spotted the woman huddled in the driver's seat, bundled tightly in a coat. Her breath misted against the glass, and she jumped slightly when he knocked on the window. "You all right in there?" Jack called over the wind, his voice steady but kind. She nodded quickly, rolling the window down just enough to speak. "Yes, I think so. I'm just really cold." "Stay put for now," Jack replied, his tone firm but reassuring. "I'll take a look under the hood." The woman nodded, relief flashing in her tired eyes as she watched him trudge back through the snow. Jack popped the hood, propping it open as the weight of the snow fought against him. The engine was dark and still, and Jack's flashlight beam traced over cables and connections as he worked. His breath fogged the air, but his hands moved with practiced ease, testing and checking until the problem became clear: a dead battery. Closing the hood, Jack stomped back to the window and knocked again. "Battery's dead," he said. "I'll give you a jump, get you running, but it won't last long in this cold. You'll need a new one soon." The woman exhaled sharply, her relief evident. "That's fine. I just need to make it somewhere warm tonight." Jack nodded, already turning back toward his truck. "Give me a few minutes." The snow kept falling as Jack worked, freezing his gloves and stinging his skin. The cables fought him, stubborn from the cold. But Jack didn't rush. His hands were steady, his movements deliberate. It was what he did best, fixing what was broken, no matter how much the world howled around him. When the sedan finally sputtered back to life, the woman climbed out of the car to thank him, her boots sinking into the snow. Her face was pale from the cold, but her eyes shone with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, pulling her coat tighter. "You've saved me tonight." Jack shrugged, already turning back to his truck. "Just glad I could help. Drive careful now, and don't stop unless you have to." The woman hesitated, watching him for a long moment. "You're a good man, Mr. Lawson." Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. "Take care now." As he watched her taillights disappear into the storm, Jack felt the cold settle deep into his bones. He glanced at the clock on the truck's dash: 8:10 p.m. The roads would only get worse from here, and Maria's table felt farther away than ever. Climbing back into the truck, Jack let out a slow breath and turned the wheel toward home. The hum of the engine was his only company, the snow swallowing everything else. In that moment, Jack told himself it didn't matter. He'd done the right thing. But still, as the road stretched on and the night grew colder, he couldn't help but think about what he'd missed. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt alone. The snowfall thickened as Jack drove back toward Greenville, the windshield wipers scraping rhythmically against the glass. His old tow truck rattled as it fought against the wind, the engine humming steady beneath the weight of the storm. Outside, the world was a haze of white snow swirling through the beams of the headlights, drifting over the empty road like a heavy blanket. Inside the cab, Jack sat in silence, his gloved hands steady on the wheel. The truck's heater hummed faintly, the air still cold enough to sting his nose. He glanced at the clock, 8:17 p.m. Christmas Eve was slipping away, minute by minute, and Maria's house felt farther away than ever. He pictured them in his mind. Maria, standing at the stove, her face soft in the warm kitchen light. The kids giggling as they tore through wrapping paper, their voices high with excitement. Jack could almost smell the ham, see the flickering glow of the Christmas tree tucked in the corner of her living room. It was a good picture, one he'd carried with him all night, but now it ached. I'll make it up to them, he thought. Next year. Or maybe tomorrow, if the snow lets up. But deep down, Jack knew there were no guarantees. Life didn't wait for anyone, he'd learned that long ago. The truck jolted slightly as he hit a hidden drift, pulling Jack's attention back to the road. The snow was piling fast now, and his headlights could barely cut through the darkness. Greenville was still miles away, and the thought of Maria's kitchen so warm and bright felt more like a memory than a destination. As he turned a corner onto the main road back into town, Jack spotted something that made him slow the truck. A little way off, near the edge of a small park, he saw a figure, a man huddled on a bench beneath a street lamp, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Jack frowned, his hands tightening on the wheel. What kind of fool sits out in a storm like this, he thought. But as the truck crawled closer, Jack caught sight of the man's thin coat, the way he rocked slightly, as if trying to keep warm. Damn it, Jack muttered under his breath, pulling the truck to a stop. He stared through the windshield for a long moment, the engine idling like a quiet argument. You've done enough tonight, a voice in his head said. You've already missed dinner. Just go home. But Jack couldn't move. He sat there, his jaw tight, staring at the man beneath the street lamp. What if no one else stops, he thought. What if this stranger froze out here tonight, on Christmas Eve, because Jack had chosen the easy thing over the right thing? Jack sighed heavily, running a gloved hand over his face. All right, he muttered, as if the truck itself needed convincing. He shifted the gear into park and climbed out, the cold hitting him like a slap. Hey there, Jack called, his voice cutting through the wind as he stomped toward the bench. The man didn't respond at first, still curled into himself, his face buried beneath a threadbare scarf. Jack stopped a few feet away and tried again, softer this time. Hey buddy, you all right? The man flinched slightly, lifting his head just enough for Jack to see him. His face was pale and windburned, his eyes tired and sunken, as if sleep had been a stranger to him for a long time. I'm fine, the man mumbled, though his teeth chattered violently, betraying him. Just resting. Resting, Jack said, shaking his head. You'll freeze out here, friend. Come on. Let's get you somewhere warm. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking toward Jack's tow truck, still running in the distance. I don't want to bother you, he said quietly. Jack's expression softened. It's no bother, he replied, his voice firm but kind. Come on. You'll be warmer in the truck. After a long pause, the man finally nodded, his movements stiff and slow. Jack took him gently by the arm, helping him to his feet. The man swayed slightly, his balance shaky, and Jack steadied him, the way he'd done countless times for trucks and cars on the verge of breaking down. Broken things, Jack thought. That's what I do. He helped the man into the passenger seat of the truck, brushing snow from his coat as he climbed back in. The warmth hit them both immediately, and Jack reached for the dial, cranking the heater up as far as it would go. Here, Jack said, pulling an old thermos from behind the seat. It's just coffee, but it's hot. Take a sip. The man took the thermos with trembling hands, his fingers raw and red from the cold. He sipped carefully, his eyes closing for a moment as the warmth spread through him. Thank you, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the truck. Jack nodded, easing the truck back onto the road. You got anywhere to go? The man shook his head slowly. Not really, he admitted. I had a place once. Not anymore. Jack didn't press. He knew better than most that life could take a man from everything he'd built and leave him standing in the cold, wondering how he'd gotten there. Well, Jack said after a pause, his voice steady. There's a shelter back in town. They'll have hot meals, warm blankets, folks will look out for you. I'll take you there. The man nodded again, his expression a mix of relief and quiet shame. Jack didn't say anything more. He just drove, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind quieter now than it had been all night. When they reached the shelter, Jack helped the man inside, where the warmth and light spilled out like a welcome. A woman at the front desk greeted them, her smile kind and familiar. Jack explained the situation briefly, and the man was ushered toward a hot meal and a cot waiting in the back. Before he left, Jack clapped him gently on the shoulder. Take care, all right. The man looked up at him, his eyes clearer now, though still tired. You didn't have to stop for me, he said softly. Jack shrugged. Yeah, well, someone had to. The man gave him a faint smile, one that Jack carried with him as he climbed back into his truck. It was nearly midnight when Jack finally pulled into his driveway. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world covered in a soft, untouched white. Jack turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at his quiet house. The porch light glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the snow-covered lawn. As Jack trudged inside, the silence of the house hit him like a physical thing. He dropped his keys on the counter, the soft clatter the only sound. The clock on the wall read 11:57 p.m. Christmas Eve, almost gone. Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he sank onto the couch, too tired to move any farther. Outside, the snow reflected the soft glow of the moon, and the world seemed peaceful, even as Jack's heart felt heavy. He'd done the right thing. He knew that. But as the clock struck midnight, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he'd traded one act of kindness for another moment of connection he'd never get back. He leaned his head back against the couch, closing his eyes as the quiet of the house wrapped around him. And for the first time that night, Jack let himself wonder, did anyone notice I wasn't there? The next morning, sunlight spilled into Jack's small living room, glinting off the snow outside and painting the walls with a pale, golden light. The house was quiet, so still that Jack could hear the soft ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the furnace struggling to keep up with the cold. Jack stirred awake on the worn couch, a thin blanket tangled around his legs. For a moment he didn't move, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as memories of the night before came back in pieces. The phone call. The woman on Highway 19, the man on the bench. Christmas Eve, he thought, his chest tightening. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 8:14 a.m. It was Christmas morning now. Sitting up slowly, Jack rubbed the back of his neck, the aches of yesterday's work settling deep into his bones. The silence of the house weighed on him, heavy and familiar. He hadn't expected Maria to wait, but still, a small part of him hoped he'd hear her voice on the answering machine or find a plate of leftovers on his doorstep. They've probably opened their presents by now, he thought. The kids will be halfway through the candy in their stockings. Jack sighed and stood, the old floor creaking beneath his boots as he shuffled into the kitchen. The coffee pot sputtered as it brewed, filling the air with the familiar, bitter scent. Jack leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the fresh blanket of snow. Everything outside looked untouched, the whole world wrapped in white and stillness, as if the town itself had taken the day off. Then came the knock. It was sharp and insistent, echoing through the quiet house and making Jack start. He frowned, setting down his coffee and making his way to the door. Hold on, he called, his voice rough with sleep. When he opened it, Jack blinked in surprise. There stood Maria, bundled up in her heavy coat, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. In one hand she held a steaming casserole dish, foil glinting in the sunlight. Behind her, Emily and Tyler stood grinning, their arms full of small, brightly wrapped presents. "Merry Christmas," Jack Maria said cheerfully, as if showing up on his doorstep at 8 in the morning was the most natural thing in the world. Jack stared at them for a beat, dumbfounded. "What? What are you all doing here?" Maria breezed past him into the house, the kids following close behind. "What does it look like? We're bringing Christmas to you." Jack shook his head, still trying to catch up as he closed the door against the cold. "But I thought." "Mom said you were helping someone last night," Emily piped up, her bright eyes shining as she hugged Jack tightly around the waist. "She said that's what makes you a hero." Jack's throat tightened as he looked down at her, ruffling her hair softly. "Your mom said that, huh?" Maria, now unpacking the casserole dish in the kitchen, shot him a knowing smile. "I figured you'd get tied up," she said. "You're not the kind of man to let someone down, even if it's Christmas Eve." She paused, her voice softening. "We missed you, Jack. But we weren't going to let you spend today alone." Jack didn't know what to say. He stood there for a long moment, taking it all in, Emily beaming up at him, Tyler bouncing on his toes with excitement, and Maria bustling in the kitchen, as if it were her own home. The little house, normally so still and quiet, was suddenly alive, filled with laughter, warmth, and the smell of something delicious. "Sit down," Maria called over her shoulder. "I made ham again. You've got some catching up to do." Jack chuckled, a sound that felt unfamiliar and good, and let himself be pulled toward the table. Tyler practically shoved a lumpy present into his hands before he could sit down. "Open it," the boy said, his grin missing a front tooth. "It's from me and Emily." Jack carefully tore off the wrapping paper, revealing a hand-knitted scarf a little uneven, in shades of deep blue. Jack held it up, his chest tightening as he looked from the scarf to their hopeful faces. "We made it with Mom," Emily said proudly. "I picked the color because you wear blue all the time." Jack swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. "It's perfect," he managed, his voice gruff with emotion. "Thank you." Tyler threw his arms around Jack's neck in a fierce hug, nearly toppling him backward. "We love you, Uncle Jack." Jack hugged him back tightly, his eyes damp as he whispered, "I love you too, buddy." Maria set a steaming plate of food in front of Jack: ham, mashed potatoes, and buttery rolls piled high. "You haven't been eating enough, have you?" she teased, though her voice was gentle. Jack smiled faintly, the warmth of it settling deep in his chest. "I'm doing all right," he said softly. "But this means a lot, Maria." "That's what family's for," she replied simply. They spent the morning together, the little house filled with the sounds of forks scraping plates, Tyler's excited chatter, and Emily giggling as she showed off her new toys. Jack sat back and watched it all, the scarf still draped around his neck, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Later, as Maria packed up to leave, she paused at the door and turned back to Jack. "You're a good man, Jack. Don't forget that." Jack smiled, small but genuine. "Thanks for bringing Christmas to me, Maria." "Always," she said softly. "And next year, you're not getting out of dinner." When they were gone, Jack stood in the doorway, watching the kids' footprints trail through the snow as they disappeared down the quiet street. His breath misted in the cold air, and he pulled the hand-knitted scarf closer around his neck. The house was quiet again when he stepped inside, but it felt different now, warmer somehow, as if the laughter had lingered even after they left. Jack sank onto the couch, a small smile still tugging at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the Christmas he'd planned, but as Jack leaned his head back and closed his eyes, he realized it was exactly the one he needed. The days after Christmas slipped by quietly in Greenville, the way they always did. Snow piled higher along the curbs, the sky stayed heavy and gray, and life settled back into its slow, familiar rhythm. Jack returned to the garage, his days filled with the steady hum of engines and the sharp clink of tools against metal. Yet something felt different. Maybe it was the warmth still lingering from Christmas morning, the sound of Emily and Tyler's laughter that seemed to echo in his memory. Or maybe it was the scarf soft and blue that Jack wore every day now, as if it carried with it the love and light of his family. Whatever it was, Jack noticed it most in the quiet moments when the phone didn't ring for hours, or when the snow fell so softly it muffled everything else. There was a restlessness inside him, like the faint hum of a motor waiting to be turned on. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, just as Jack was tightening the last bolt under the hood of an old pickup, the bell above the garage door jingled. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag, and turned to see who had come in. The woman who stepped inside was familiar, though she looked very different from the last time Jack had seen her. Gone was the panic in her face, the shivering uncertainty in her voice. She walked in with quiet confidence, her polished black boots clicking softly against the concrete floor. Her gray wool coat, dusted with snowflakes, looked as out of place among the oil-streaked tools as it had the first time. Jack set the rag down on the workbench, raising an eyebrow. "Didn't expect to see you again." She smiled a small, warm smile that softened her features. "I'm not sure you remember me." Highway 19, Jack interrupted, with a faint smile of his own. "Dead battery. Christmas Eve." The woman laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's right, I'm surprised you remember." "Not many people call for help that late in a snowstorm," Jack replied, though his tone was kind. He looked at her more closely this time. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her eyes, though bright, held something thoughtful in them. "I came to thank you," the woman said simply. "That night, you didn't have to help me. But you did." Jack shrugged, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Wasn't much to it, just did what needed doing." The woman looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read him, to figure out how a man like Jack Lawson came to be who he was. Finally, she spoke. "My name's Claire Dawson." The name rang a faint bell, though Jack couldn't quite place it. "All right, Ms. Dawson," he said. "Glad you made it home safe." Claire reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. She held it out to Jack, her expression calm but insistent. "This is for you." Jack eyed the envelope warily but took it, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It wasn't heavy, but something about it made him hesitate. He glanced back up at Claire. "What is it?" "Open it." Jack unfolded the envelope carefully, and his eyes widened when he saw what was inside: a check, clean and crisp, with his name written neatly across it. $10,000. Jack looked up sharply, frowning. "This some kind of mistake?" Claire shook her head, her voice steady. "It's no mistake. That's my way of saying thank you." Jack's brow furrowed as he held the check up between his fingers, as if trying to see through it. $10,000 is a lot of thank you. "It's what you deserve," Claire replied simply. "That night you didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything in return. You just helped because someone needed you." "That's not why I do it," Jack said firmly, his tone low. "I don't take money for doing what's right." "I know," Claire replied softly. "And that's exactly why I'm here." Jack hesitated, glancing back at the check. The garage was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The thought of what $10,000 could do it nagged at him. The tow truck needed new brakes, the air compressor was on its last legs, and the heater in the garage sputtered more often than it worked. He could do a lot with that kind of money. But still, the idea of taking it didn't sit right. Jack shook his head, holding the check back out to her. "I can't take this, Ms. Dawson. I was just doing my job." Claire didn't take the check. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but insistent. "Mr. Lawson, Jack, I run a technology company. Dawson Systems. We build software for businesses all over the world. Most of my days are spent with people who only offer help when there's something in it for them. That night, You reminded me of something important, what it means to help simply because you can. That's worth far more than $10,000. Jack stared at her for a long moment. Her words hung in the air, heavy and honest, and for the first time, Jack really looked at her, not just at the coat and boots and polished confidence, but at the woman beneath all of it. There was something real in her gaze, something sincere, and it made Jack pause. I don't need a reward for doing the right thing, he said quietly, though his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. Claire smiled faintly. I figured you'd say that. But this isn't just a reward, it's an opportunity. Jack raised an eyebrow. An opportunity for what? Claire stepped closer, her expression earnest now. I want you to come to the city. My company has a fleet of vehicles, trucks, vans, service cars, and we've been having constant breakdowns. I need someone I can trust to take a look, figure out what's wrong, and help us keep them running. I think you're that person. Jack blinked, taken aback. You're offering me a job. It's a contract, Claire clarified, if you're willing. Come see it for yourself. If it's not for you, that's fine. But I think you'll find there's more work out there for someone like you than you realize. Jack stared at her, his hands shifting slightly as he held the envelope. The idea of going to the city, leaving Greenville, even for a little while, felt strange. Out of place, like a tool in the wrong drawer. He wasn't the kind of man who belonged in sleek offices or busy streets. He belonged here, in this garage, fixing what was broken and helping the people who relied on him. But then he thought about the check in his hand, the new brakes for the tow truck. The heater that wouldn't quit on him this winter. He thought about Emily and Tyler, about the way they'd hugged him on Christmas morning, and how proud they'd been to give him that scarf. Finally, Jack sighed, slipping the check carefully back into the envelope. He looked up at Claire, his voice steady but cautious. I'll think about it. Claire smiled, as if she'd already known he would. That's all I'm asking. She extended her hand, and after a beat, Jack shook it. Her grip was firm, confident, and for a moment Jack couldn't help but feel like he was standing on the edge of something new, something he didn't quite understand yet. Thank you for hearing me out, Jack, Claire said. My assistant will send you the details if you decide to come. Jack nodded, watching as she turned and walked back out into the snow, her boots clicking softly against the concrete. He stood there for a long while after she'd gone, the envelope still in his hands, the garage suddenly quiet again. Jack glanced down at the check once more before tucking it carefully into the pocket of his coat. He didn't know what he'd decide just yet. But as he turned back to the old pickup waiting on the lift, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, something like possibility. A week passed before Jack heard from Claire Dawson again. In the days that followed her visit, her black envelope sat untouched on the kitchen counter, the check still neatly folded inside. Jack spent his days the way he always had, fixing trucks, tightening bolts, and helping whoever came through the garage doors. Yet every time he leaned over an engine or wiped his hands clean, the thought of her offer lingered in the back of his mind. On a cold Friday morning, as frost covered the windows and the sky threatened more snow, the phone in the garage rang. Jack straightened from under the hood of an old sedan, stretching his back with a groan before grabbing the receiver. Lawson's garage. Jack speaking. Hello, Mr. Lawson, it's Claire Dawson's office, a cheerful voice said. Ms. Dawson asked me to check in and see if you'd given any thought to her offer. Jack glanced over his shoulder at the empty garage, the soft hum of the heater the only sound. He let out a slow breath, his voice steady as he replied. Tell her I'll come take a look. That Sunday morning, Jack found himself driving his old tow truck down a highway that seemed to stretch forever. The snow had cleared for the moment, the sun glinting off miles of white fields. As the city came into view, its tall buildings cutting sharply into the winter sky, Jack tightened his grip on the wheel, a knot of unease settling in his chest. He didn't belong here. Or at least, that's what he told himself. The city was too fast, too big, too far removed from the steady rhythm of Greenville. But he'd given Claire his word, and that was reason enough to show up. When he pulled into the Dawson Systems parking lot, the glass and steel headquarters loomed like a monument to a different kind of life. Rows of company vans and trucks sat neatly parked nearby, their white exteriors gleaming under the sun. Jack's old tow truck looked like a relic among them, its rusted edges and faded paint standing out against all that polish. Claire was waiting near the building's entrance, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, her breath misting in the cold. She smiled as Jack climbed out of the truck, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. "You made it," she said warmly. Jack nodded, his expression reserved. "Figured I'd take a look." Claire gestured for him to follow, leading him around to a massive garage tucked behind the headquarters. Inside, Jack found rows of service vehicles in various states of disrepair, vans with tires missing, trucks with hoods popped open, and a handful of mechanics working quietly at their stations. The space was sleek, modern, and far too clean for Jack's liking. "This is our fleet garage," Claire explained. "We've had breakdowns all winter, engines failing, parts giving out too soon. I've had 3 mechanics come through in the last 6 months, but nothing's gotten better." Jack walked slowly down the line of vehicles, running his hand over the cold metal of a van's hood. He knelt to inspect a tire, noting the uneven wear, then glanced at the workstations, where expensive tools sat lined up like trophies. Everything here was state-of-the-art, yet something felt off. "You're treating the symptoms, not the cause," Jack said finally, rising to his feet. Claire raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jack turned to face her, wiping his hands on his rag out of habit. "These trucks aren't getting the attention they need day to day. The little things get missed, and eventually they turn into big problems. Tires don't wear out like this unless alignment's off. Engines don't fail unless maintenance is late." Claire listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "So what would you do?" Jack glanced around the garage again, his eyes sharp but calm. "First thing? Get a system in place. Regular inspections, scheduled maintenance, check every truck, every week, whether it needs it or not. Second, you need someone who knows what to look for, someone who doesn't rush the job because they're trying to hit a quota." Claire smiled faintly, as if she'd been waiting for him to say exactly that. "And would you be that someone?" Jack hesitated, looking back at the row of trucks. He thought of his garage in Greenville, the cracked floors and old tools, the way he knew every customer by name. This place was as far from home as he could imagine. But then he thought of something else: the stranded woman on Highway 19. The man freezing on a bench, and the way it felt to know he'd made a difference, however small. Finally, Jack turned back to Claire, his voice steady. "I'm not looking to leave Greenville. But I could come here for a while, get things running right. Show your crew what to look for. After that, it's up to you to keep it going." Claire's face lit up, her smile genuine and relieved. "That's all I need, Jack. A fresh start for this place." Jack nodded, the decision settling in his chest like a weight lifting. He wasn't leaving his home behind. He was just helping where he was needed, same as always. Over the next few weeks, Jack split his time between Greenville and the city. Mornings began early in the Dawson Systems garage, where Jack worked side by side with Claire's mechanics, showing them how to check belts, test batteries, and listen for trouble before it started. His hands, as calloused and steady as ever, brought life back into engines that others had given up on. At night, Jack drove his old truck back to Greenville, where the snow was quieter and the pace slower. His garage still stood waiting for him, and his regular customers, farmers, neighbors, and friends still stopped by to say hello. On one of those nights, as Jack pulled into his driveway, he found Emily and Tyler waiting for him, bundled up in their coats, their faces flushed with excitement. "Uncle Jack," Emily called, running up to hug him as soon as he stepped out of the truck. "Mom says you're fixing the whole city." Jack laughed, ruffling her hat. "Not the whole city, kiddo. Just some trucks." Tyler tugged on his sleeve. "Are you gonna stay there forever?" Jack knelt to meet the boy's wide-eyed gaze, his voice soft but certain. "No, buddy. Greenville's home. I'm just helping out for a while, that's all. Emily grinned, taking his hand. Mom says you're a hero. Like the kind in stories. Jack shook his head with a small smile. I'm no hero, Em. Just a guy who fixes things. That's what heroes do, she insisted. Jack's smile grew, and as he stood, he looked out at the quiet street, the snow falling softly around them. Maybe Emily was right, in her own way. Heroes didn't always wear capes or save the day with grand gestures. Sometimes they were just people who showed up, people who fixed what was broken and helped where they could. And that, Jack realized, was enough.